Bedtime Biographies, Theodore Roosevelt. It is October in Manhattan, 1858. Gas lamps flicker along 23rd Street. The Civil War is still 3 years away. And in a brownstone on East 20th Street, a boy is born who will spend his whole life running toward what terrifies him most. Theodore Roosevelt arrived gasping. His lungs seized. Asthma would follow him through childhood like a shadow, each attack sudden and suffocating. Doctors had no answer. But something in him refused to break. Instead of accepting the body he was given, he would remake it entirely. He would chase vigor as if his life depended on it. Because he believed it did. This is the story of a boy who collected the bones of dead animals and dreamed of wilderness, who became a cowboy, a soldier, a reformer, a president, who built dams and broke trusts and sent ships across oceans. A man of contradictions, fierce yet literary, ambitious yet haunted by loss. His was a life of constant motion, constant striving, as though he were always running from that gasping child he had been. Tonight on Bedtime Biographies, we'll follow him through it all. The rise from sickness to power, the sudden reversals that changed everything, and what remained when the running finally stopped. Dim your lights now. Find your place. Let yourself settle. If sleep comes before the end, that's exactly right. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Let us begin in the autumn darkness of 1858. A sickly beginning. A sickly beginning. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. entered the world on October 27, 1858, at 28 East 20th Street in Manhattan, arriving into a household already shaped by the rhythms of a prominent New York family. His parents were Martha Stewart Bullock and businessman Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a man of considerable standing, whose presence would define much of the boy's early years, though not for as long as either might have wished. The family possessed that particular form of privilege that carried with it not ease, but expectation, the unspoken assumption that Roosevelt children would amount to something. He came into the world with an older sister, Anna, known to the family as Bamie, and would soon be joined by a younger brother, Elliot, and another sister, Corinne. The household was not one of idle wealth, but rather one animated by purpose and the understanding that life was a matter of consequence. Yet from his earliest days, Theodore Jr. was visited by a peculiar and terrible affliction. Debilitating asthma attacks would seize him with terrifying regularity, leaving him gasping for breath in moments of pure physical desperation. The attacks terrified not only the boy himself, but his parents as well, gripping them with the helpless anguish that can only come from watching a child suffer without remedy. Doctors of that era had no cure to offer, no explanation that satisfied, no treatment that reliably brought relief. The condition cast a shadow across his childhood, the spectre of illness that seemed to promise a truncated life, a narrowed existence of indoor confinement and careful limitation. It was a biological sentence that might have crushed many spirits into permanent resignation. Yet even as asthma constrained his body, something else animated his spirit entirely. Theodore was energetic and mischievously inquisitive in ways that seemed to contradict his fragile constitution. He was the sort of child who burned with questions, who needed to understand the mechanics of things, who could not rest until he had investigated and catalogued the world according to his own system. This hunger for knowledge, this restless intellectual appetite, would shape the whole trajectory of his life, not despite his sickness, but partly in response to it, as though his mind worked overtime to compensate for what his lungs could not reliably deliver. His naturalist inclinations awakened early and with surprising intensity. At the age of 7, young Theodore encountered a dead seal at a market in Manhattan. The encounter appears trivial in retrospect, a small moment easily overlooked, yet it ignited something profound within him. Rather than moving past the sight, he became fixed upon it. He obtained the seal's head through means the record does not elaborate upon, and with the enthusiasm characteristic of children who have discovered a project that consumes them entirely. He recruited his cousins to join in an enterprise of considerable ambition, the creation of the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. It was a pretentious name for what was surely a modest collection, and yet the pretension itself reveals something about the child's imagination. He was already thinking in terms of systems, institutions, the formal organization of knowledge. Having taught himself the rudiments of taxidermy, Theodore filled his makeshift museum with specimens he had personally killed or caught. He was not content to merely observe nature. He needed to possess it, to preserve it, to arrange it according to principles of order and classification. By the age of 9, his observations had crystallized into something more formal still. A paper entitled The Natural History of Insects, a title that suggests he was already thinking like a scholar, already understanding that observations must be recorded, systematized, and presented. The boy who could barely breathe during his asthma attacks was simultaneously engaged in the meticulous work of scientific documentation. The contrast is almost unbearable. The fragility of the physical body paired with the fierce determination of the intellect. During these childhood years, Roosevelt's family undertook a series of extended journeys that would prove formative in ways both obvious and subtle. In 1869, and again in 1870, the family toured Europe, exposing young Theodore to landscapes and cultures beyond the confines of New York. Then, in 1872, came a journey to Egypt, an expedition that carried the boy across an ocean to a land of ancient civilizations and vast horizons. These travels were not the casual vacations of wealthy families seeking distraction. They were educational ventures undertaken with purpose, designed to enlarge the minds and perspectives of the children. For Theodore, in particular, already inclined toward the systematic study of nature and geography, such exposure was formative. He was learning to see the world not as a series of disconnected places, but as a vast, interconnected whole worthy of careful study and understanding. It was during one of these European journeys, while hiking with his family in the Alps in 1869, that Theodore made a discovery that would alter the trajectory of his life. He found, through the simple act of physical exertion in mountainous terrain, that strenuous exercise seemed to minimize his asthma and to bolster his spirits in ways that nothing else had managed. The connection was not immediately systematized into doctrine, rather. It came to him as a kind of revelation through experience. Walking, climbing, pushing his body to its limits in the high alpine air, these activities brought relief and something more than relief. They brought vitality, a sense of possibility, a glimpse of what his body might accomplish, despite its apparent limitations. This discovery proved to be one of the most consequential insights of his childhood. Upon returning from these travels, Theodore began what would become a lifelong commitment to vigorous, systematic exercise. It was not the casual recreation of a boy who enjoyed outdoor games. It was instead a deliberate regime, undertaken with almost military discipline, designed to strengthen his body and fortify his resistance to the asthma that had haunted him since birth. He threw himself into physical training with the same intensity he brought to his naturalist studies, as though he understood, at some level too deep for articulate thought, that his body was a machine that could be improved through application and will. The regime of exercise soon extended beyond hiking and walking. At some point during his youth, after an incident in which older boys manhandled him on the way to a camping trip, Theodore recognized a gap in his physical capabilities that extended beyond simple aerobic capacity. He sought out a boxing coach and began to train, learning the formal techniques of the sport. Here was a boy who should have been fragile by all the logic of his asthma, learning instead to fight, literally and figuratively acquiring the skills to defend himself against larger opponents. The boxing trainer became a kind of mentor, teaching him not merely technique, but also something about courage and perseverance in the face of physical challenge. Yet even as Theodore dedicated himself to this physical regime, his education proceeded through channels that might have seemed unconventional even by the standards of the day. He was homeschooled, educated within the family rather than sent to formal institutions. The arrangement had clear advantages: a curriculum tailored to his interests, instruction from tutors presumably selected with care, the flexibility to pursue his naturalist investigations without the rigid constraints of institutional schedules. Yet, as his later biographer H.W. Brands would observe, the most obvious drawback was uneven coverage of various areas of knowledge. Theodore's education reflected the particular geography of his intellectual interests. In geography itself, he was solid and capable. History engaged his mind thoroughly, and he demonstrated genuine brightness in the subject. His knowledge of biology was substantial and growing deeper through his own systematic investigations. He acquired facility in French and German, languages that opened to him the scientific literature of Europe. Yet mathematics proved troublesome, a subject that did not ignite his imagination or command his focus. The classical languages, Latin and Greek, also presented difficulties, resisting the same sort of passionate engagement that animated his work in natural history. It was a patchwork sort of education, strong in the areas where his interests burned brightest, weaker in those domains that did not capture his imagination. In September of 1876, at the age of 17, Theodore Roosevelt entered Harvard University, one of the nation's most prestigious institutions, and an institution that would prove neither entirely satisfying nor entirely formative to his intellectual development. His father, before his own life would be abruptly curtailed, offered his son clear guidance about the priorities of his college years. Take care of your morals first, your health next, and finally, your studies. The hierarchy reveals much about the values of Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a man of Presbyterian conviction who understood that character and physical vitality mattered more than academic achievement. The young Theodore would carry these priorities with him throughout his years at Harvard, understanding his education not as an end in itself, but as one element within a larger project of self-development. The years at Harvard were marked by what might be called intellectual precocity, paired with a persistent sense of dissatisfaction. Roosevelt did well in the subjects that engaged him. Science courses stimulated his mind. Philosophy offered intellectual challenges worthy of his considerable powers. And rhetoric, the formal study of persuasive speech, proved natural territory for a young man of his particular gifts. Yet Latin and Greek continued to present obstacles, subjects where his photographic memory, which served him so well elsewhere, could not quite overcome his fundamental lack of engagement with the material. By the time he entered Harvard, Roosevelt was already an accomplished naturalist, already a published ornithologist, a scientist in the formal sense, with contributions to the body of knowledge that extended beyond the collections of his childhood museum. His studies in biology were conducted with an intensity that spoke to a genuine vocation, a sense that this was not merely a subject, but a calling. He read with voracious appetite, and with a retention so complete that observers frequently remarked upon his almost photographic memory. One could offer him a fact, and it would lodge in his mind with the permanence of something printed on a page. This capacity for retention, combined with his breadth of reading and his systematic approach to knowledge, made him formidable in intellectual company. Yet Roosevelt's Harvard years were not devoted entirely to the classroom. He participated actively in rowing and in boxing, maintaining the physical regimen that had become central to his sense of self. He was a member of Alpha Delta Phi, a literary society, and also affiliated with Delta Kappa Epsilon, a fraternity whose membership he valued. He was, moreover, elected to membership in the Porcellian Club, a particularly prestigious honor that spoke to his standing among his peers. In 1880, upon his graduation, he received the degree of Bachelor of Arts magna cum laude, graduating Phi Beta Kappa with a rank of 22nd out of 177, a respectable achievement that reflected his considerable but not extraordinary academic performance. What is most striking about Roosevelt's own assessment of his Harvard education is the dissatisfaction he expressed with the experience, even after having performed so creditably. In attempting to analyze and weigh what he had gained from his college years, he concluded that he had obtained little from Harvard. The formalistic treatment of many subjects had depressed him. He had chafed against what he perceived as rigidity, the meticulous attention to minutiae that seemed important in themselves, but that somehow were never linked up with the whole. Here was a mind that wanted to see connections, to understand how various domains of knowledge related to and illuminated one another, to grasp not isolated facts, but comprehensive systems of understanding. The compartmentalization of knowledge that Harvard's curriculum enforced struck him as fundamentally at odds with the way his mind actually worked. Yet even as Roosevelt felt this dissatisfaction with his formal education, he carried with him from Harvard something more valuable than any specific body of knowledge, a sense of intellectual confidence, a belief that his mind was capable of rigorous work, an understanding that reading and study could yield genuine mastery over a subject. These intangible acquisitions would serve him far better in the long run than any diploma or degree. Upon graduation, Roosevelt faced the question that confronts all young men of promise and privileged background: what sort of life to build? He had initially formed a plan to pursue formal study in natural science, to make the systematic investigation of nature his profession. Yet this intention proved to be short-lived. Instead, in a decision that would redirect the entire course of his life, he gave up that plan and enrolled at Columbia Law School, moving back into his family's home in New York. The choice seems to have been made with a certain reluctance, as though Roosevelt understood that the naturalist's path, however alluring in the abstract, did not sufficiently address what he increasingly sensed was his true vocation: to serve in some capacity that placed him at the center of public affairs. As a student of law, Roosevelt proved to be capable and able, yet the subject itself remained fundamentally unsatisfying to him. There was something in the logic of law, in its procedures and conventions, that struck him as irrational, not in the sense of being illogical, but rather in the sense of being disconnected from larger purposes and larger truths. The law seemed to him a discipline that attended to form rather than substance, to procedure rather than to justice itself. Yet even as he harbored these reservations about his formal studies, something else was beginning to crystallize within him: a determination to enter politics to position himself within the machinery of government, where decisions about the direction of the nation were actually made. With this goal in mind, Roosevelt began attending meetings at Morton Hall, the headquarters of the Republican Association of New York's 21st District. This was an unconventional choice for a man of his class and background. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., had been a prominent member of the Republican Party, so the affiliation itself was not surprising. Yet most of Roosevelt's social peers refrained from becoming too closely involved in the actual machinery of politics, viewing direct participation as somehow beneath them, or at least excessive in its demands. Roosevelt, by contrast, saw in political engagement something worthy of his time and energy. He found allies within the local Republican Party, and his political education accelerated rapidly. In what might be seen as an early manifestation of the reform impulses that would animate much of his later career, Roosevelt soon began to move against the political establishment of his own party. He set his sights on defeating a Republican state assemblyman who was closely tied to the political machine of Senator Roscoe Conkling, one of the most powerful figures in New York politics. It was a bold move for someone new to politics, an assertion of independence that could easily have ended in humiliation and political isolation. Yet, Roosevelt possessed the combination of confidence, intelligence, and determination required to carry it off. He won the election, achieving a political victory that announced his arrival as a political force to be reckoned with. This early success proved consequential enough that Roosevelt felt emboldened to make another significant decision. He dropped out of law school. He had obtained what he needed from legal education, enough knowledge to navigate the political landscape perhaps, and enough understanding of the machinery of governance to function effectively within it. Rather than completing his degree, he turned his full attention to politics, driven by an increasingly clear sense of purpose. "I intended to be one of the governing class," he would later say, a statement that reveals the grandeur of his ambitions, but also a certain clarity about what he believed his life should accomplish. These early political successes occurred, however, against a background of personal tragedy that would test Roosevelt's resilience in ways that even his childhood asthma had not. In 1878, while Theodore was still a student at Harvard, his father died suddenly. The death devastated the young man, who had always looked to his father as a model of principled engagement with the world, a Presbyterian gentleman whose moral seriousness and civic commitment had shaped all of Roosevelt's sense of what a man ought to be. The inheritance that Theodore received, $60,000, an amount equivalent to approximately $1,700,000 in modern currency, provided financial security that would free him from the necessity of earning a conventional living for the rest of his life. Yet no amount of money could compensate for the loss of his father's presence and guidance. In the years following his father's death, Roosevelt sought to honor his memory in various ways. His father, a devout Presbyterian, had been in the habit of regularly leading his family in prayers. While at Harvard, Theodore had emulated this example of religious devotion by undertaking to teach Sunday school for more than 3 years at the Episcopal Christ Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Here was another manifestation of that quality that would define much of his life, the tendency to commit himself fully to whatever undertaking he had undertaken, to give himself over to a project with complete attention. Yet when the minister at Christ Church insisted that Roosevelt formally become an Episcopalian as a condition of continuing his teaching, he declined. Rather than compromise on a matter of conscience or allow institutional requirements to dictate his actions, Roosevelt simply moved his efforts elsewhere, beginning to teach a mission class in a poor section of Cambridge. The principle mattered more to him than the position, a priority that would similarly animate his approach to political life. By the early 1880s, as Roosevelt's political career was beginning to gather momentum, he had already distinguished himself through his intellectual labors in the realm of naval history and strategy. While still at Harvard, he had undertaken a systematic and comprehensive study of the role played by the United States Navy in the War of 1812. This was not merely antiquarian interest. Rather, it was an investigation conducted with scholarly rigor, animated by a conviction that understanding the past could illuminate the present and shape the future. The result of this research and reflection was the publication in 1882 of the Naval War of 1812, a book that would establish Roosevelt's reputation as both a historian and a popular writer of considerable skill. The work itself was notable for its approach and its execution. Rather than offering a grand narrative of the war as a whole, Roosevelt had conducted detailed comparisons of British and American naval leadership, examining the record down to the level of individual ship-to-ship engagements. The book was praised for both its scholarship and its style, for the rigor with which Roosevelt had investigated his sources, and for the clarity and vigor with which he presented his findings. It would endure as a standard study of the war, consulted by naval historians and military strategists for generations to come. Here was tangible evidence that Roosevelt possessed the capacity for serious intellectual work, that his interests extended beyond the purely political, that he could bring scholarly discipline to bear on complex historical questions. There would be, in later years, some speculation about the sources of Roosevelt's ideas regarding naval power and strategy. Some observers believed that his thinking had been substantially derived from the work of Alfred Thayer Mahan, an author who had become influential in naval circles by popularizing the concept that only nations possessing significant naval power had been able to influence history, to dominate the oceans, to exert their diplomatic influence to its fullest extent, and to defend their borders effectively. Yet naval historian Nicholas Danby has argued persuasively that Roosevelt's ideas and interests in naval matters actually predated his meeting with Mahan, or his reading of his work, that Roosevelt had arrived at these conclusions independently through his own historical investigations. Chapter 1. A sickly beginning whether Roosevelt had arrived at his convictions through independent inquiry or had been shaped by later exposure to Mahan's theories, his intellectual engagement with naval history demonstrated something profoundly important about his character and capacity. The Naval War of 1812 was not the work of a dilettante or a mere politician dabbling in historical matters for effect. It was a sustained, rigorous examination of a complex historical episode, executed with genuine scholarly apparatus. Roosevelt had immersed himself in primary documents, comparative naval records, and strategic analyses. He had interviewed veterans and consulted the archives available to him. The resulting book bore the marks of serious intellectual labor, the kind of work that could not be rushed, could not be faked, and would not have impressed contemporary reviewers had it lacked genuine substance. The publication of this work marked a turning point in how Roosevelt was perceived by those who had known him only as an energetic but somewhat undisciplined young politician. Here was tangible evidence that beneath the restlessness, the apparent hunger for activity and excitement, there lay a capacity for sustained focus and intellectual discipline. The praise the book received was not the polite acknowledgement given to a gentleman's amateur effort. It was the genuine recognition according to a work that met the standards of serious historical scholarship. This distinction would prove significant as Roosevelt's career unfolded, for it established early on that he was not merely a man of action, nor simply a politician seeking to advance himself through public service. He possessed intellectual resources that extended beyond the purely political realm. The question of Roosevelt's naval philosophy and its origins would persist in various forms throughout his career, particularly when he occupied positions of greater authority and could actually shape naval policy rather than merely write about it. It would resurface when he served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, when he championed the construction of battleships, when he oversaw the expansion of American naval capacity, and when he sent the Great White Fleet on its epical voyage around the world. At those later moments, observers and critics alike would point back to his published work on naval history as evidence of long-standing ideological commitment to sea power, or alternatively, as the source from which he had derived his strategic thinking. Yet, the chronology suggested by naval historian Nicholas Danby's careful analysis offered a different interpretation of Roosevelt's intellectual development. Danby's work, built upon meticulous examination of Roosevelt's correspondence and the dates of his various readings and writings, established with considerable persuasiveness that Roosevelt had already formulated his fundamental beliefs about the role of naval power in national affairs before he encountered Mahan's influential publications. This finding was not merely a matter of scholarly interest in questions of intellectual history, though it certainly possessed that dimension. Rather, it suggested that Roosevelt's ideas about naval power, about the necessity for nations to maintain adequate maritime strength, about the connection between control of the seas and the ability to project power internationally, had emerged from Roosevelt's own engagement with history rather than from the absorption of another thinker's theories. This distinction bore important implications. It suggested that Roosevelt thought more independently, at least in this domain, than might otherwise be assumed. He had not simply become converted to Mahan's doctrine and then spent the remainder of his career implementing it. Rather, his reading of history had brought him to conclusions that happened to align with and be reinforced by Mahan's later exposition of similar ideas. When the two men's work and thought did intersect, as they inevitably would, given their mutual interest in naval matters and their presence in overlapping circles of American political and intellectual life, Roosevelt could engage with Mahan's arguments not as an acolyte encountering a master, but as a fellow thinker who had arrived at compatible conclusions through somewhat different routes. The Naval War of 1812 also revealed something else about Roosevelt's approach to knowledge and understanding. He was not content with abstractions or general principles divorced from concrete examples. He studied specific engagements, analyzed the conduct of particular commanders, compared the performance of individual ships and their crews. His work bore the marks of someone who believed that understanding came not from grand theorizing alone, but from patient examination of particulars. This methodological commitment would characterize much of his subsequent intellectual work. Whether he was writing about frontier history, exploring questions of conservation policy, or attempting to understand the complexities of international relations. In the years immediately following the publication of the Naval War of 1812, Roosevelt's path would take him away from historical scholarship and back toward practical politics and, eventually, toward the realm of action. Yet the intellectual foundation he had laid in this early work remained with him. It informed his thinking about national security, about the proper role of military power in a democratic state, about the connection between historical understanding and present policy. when he later held positions from which he could actually influence the development of American naval capacity. The ideas he had worked through in historical form became operative principles guiding concrete decisions about battleship construction, naval deployment, and strategic positioning. The completion of the Naval War of 1812 also marked the end of Roosevelt's serious engagement with formal historical scholarship, at least in the intensive sense he had pursued while at Harvard and in the years immediately following his graduation. He would continue to write. His later works on the winning of the West, his ranch narratives, his autobiography. And these works possessed genuine literary merit and continued to display his engagement with historical subjects. But he would never again undertake a project quite like the Naval War of 1812, where the primary object was the establishment of historical truth through careful scholarship rather than the communication of experience or the narration of events he had witnessed or participated in. In this sense, the Naval War of 1812 represented both a culmination and a conclusion. It was the culmination of Roosevelt's development as a young scholar, the fullest expression of his capacity to engage in sustained, disciplined intellectual work of the historical kind. But it was also, in a certain sense, a conclusion to that phase of his life. The ambitions that had driven him to undertake such a project, the desire to make a name for himself through scholarship, to be recognized as a serious historian, would soon be channeled in different directions. The energy that might have been devoted to further historical research and writing would instead be directed toward political activity, toward reform efforts, toward military service, and eventually toward the highest office in the land. Yet the book endured. It continued to be consulted by naval historians and military strategists long after Roosevelt had moved on to other pursuits. It remained in print and in use in military academies and among serious students of American naval history. This durability testified to the genuine quality of the work, to the fact that Roosevelt had produced something of lasting value, despite his relative youth and the compressed time frame in which he had completed it. The Naval War of 1812 would ensure that even had Roosevelt never entered politics, even had he never achieved public prominence through any other means, he would be remembered as someone who had made a meaningful contribution to historical understanding. The Strenuous Rise. Chapter 2. The Strenuous Rise. The words came first as a quiet refusal, spoken with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to calculate his own ambitions against the machinery of party politics. When Henry Cabot Lodge and others had urged him to run for vice president in 1900, Theodore Roosevelt had issued a public statement saying that he would not accept the nomination. This was the language of restraint, of a man still in his early 40s who believed himself better suited to the governor's chair of New York, still ascending, still building something tangible in a position where action meant something. Yet even as he spoke these words of refusal, the mechanisms of political power were already moving around him, indifferent to his stated preferences. It was Thomas Platt, the boss of the New York Republican machine, who set these mechanisms in motion. Platt had grown weary of the governor, of his reformist impulses and his refusal to be entirely managed, of the way he seemed always to be looking beyond the office he held towards something larger. Eager to be rid of Roosevelt, Platt nonetheless began a newspaper campaign in favor of Roosevelt's nomination for the vice presidency. The logic was simple: remove him to an office of powerlessness, exile him to a position that historical precedent had rendered almost ceremonial. Roosevelt, sensing both the danger and the opportunity in this maneuver, struck a bargain with Platt. He would accept the nomination if the convention offered it to him, but would otherwise serve another term as governor. This was a calculated statement of independence, a way of refusing to be pushed while leaving room to be pulled. Platt asked Pennsylvania party boss Matthew Quay to lead the campaign for Roosevelt's nomination. At the 1900 Republican National Convention, Quay outmaneuvered Mark Hanna, the formidable kingmaker who had orchestrated McKinley's rise to power. The machinery turned. Roosevelt won the nomination unanimously, a thundering declaration of support that transformed what had been designed as an exile into something that resembled, on the surface, a triumph. How much of this triumph was orchestrated? How much was genuine enthusiasm for the energetic young governor from New York remains a question that history has not entirely resolved. What was clear was that the vice presidency, that graveyard of political aspirations, awaited him. But before the office itself came the campaign. And in the campaign, Roosevelt found a form of expression that suited him entirely. His vice presidential campaigning proved highly energetic and a match for the barnstorming style of Democratic presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan, whose silver tongue and platform eloquence had made him a force in American politics. In a whirlwind campaign that displayed his energy to the public in ways that seemed almost inexhaustible, Roosevelt made 480 stops in 23 states. He traveled with the intensity of a man who had lived much and believed that stillness was a form of death, moving through the American landscape like a force of nature. Speaking, arguing, connecting, he denounced the radicalism of Bryan, contrasting it with the heroism of those who had won the war against Spain, the conflict that had transformed the United States into an imperial power and that had given Roosevelt himself his moment of military glory. Bryan had strongly supported the war itself, but he denounced the annexation of the Philippines as imperialism, as a betrayal of American principles. Roosevelt countered that it was best for the Filipinos to have stability and the Americans to have a proud place in the world. This was the language of civilization and order, of the great power's responsibility to govern the peoples of the earth. It was a language he would speak for the rest of his life, though it would evolve and deepen and become more complicated. The voters gave McKinley an even larger victory than that which he had achieved in 1896. Roosevelt's energy had served the ticket. The engine of his ambition, temporarily housed in his body and expressed through his voice, had moved thousands and influenced millions. He had proven, once again, that he possessed something that could not be manufactured or learned in any school, a capacity to reach people, to persuade them, to make them feel that what he was saying mattered because he believed it with such profound conviction. On March 4th, 1901, Roosevelt took office as vice president. The office was a powerless sinecure, and it did not suit his aggressive temperament in any way that might be measured or documented. The power of the presidency belonged to William McKinley, the quiet Ohioan who had guided the nation through war and economic expansion. Roosevelt found himself in a position that history had created specifically to occupy ambitious men who could not yet be trusted with actual authority. His 6 months as vice president were uneventful and boring for a man of action. He had no power. He presided over the Senate for a mere 4 days before it adjourned. The institution itself, with all its ceremonial gravity, could not contain him. It was in this period of constraint, of enforced inactivity, that Roosevelt began to formulate ideas that would outlast him. The compression of his energy into a powerless office seemed to concentrate it, to force it into channels of thought and reflection. On September 2nd, 1901, Roosevelt first publicized an aphorism that thrilled his supporters, that would be repeated and referenced and misunderstood for decades to come. Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. There was something almost paradoxical about this statement, coming from a man who rarely spoke softly, whose voice was known to fill rooms and carry across landscapes. Perhaps he understood, in some deep part of himself, that true power did not require constant assertion, that the appearance of restraint could be more effective than its absence. Or perhaps he was simply prescient enough to understand that the world was changing, that the age of bombast was giving way to an age in which power would be exercised in quieter registers, through the manipulation of information and the careful calibration of force. The aphorism hung in the air of American consciousness, waiting. It would not be long before Roosevelt himself would have the opportunity to test its truth, to discover whether speaking softly while carrying a large stick would indeed take him as far as his deepest ambitions suggested it might. Chapter 2. The Strenuous Rise output, continuing from the aphorism, would come soon enough. The machinery of power, once set in motion, does not pause for philosophical reflection. Roosevelt's ascent to the presidency itself arrived with the swiftness of tragedy, the kind of rupture that transforms a man's entire existence in an instant. On September 6, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. Roosevelt, who had been vacationing in Île-la-Motte, Vermont, made the journey to Buffalo to visit McKinley in the hospital. When the president's condition appeared to stabilize, Roosevelt returned to his vacation, believing the crisis had passed. But the body has its own logic, its own timeline of deterioration, and McKinley's condition worsened with alarming speed. Roosevelt rushed back to Buffalo, arriving at North Creek when word came that McKinley had died on September 14. He continued to Buffalo and was sworn in as the 26th president at the Ansley Wilcox House. At 42 years old, suddenly thrust into an office he had not sought, and a responsibility that would consume the remainder of his presidency with the energy that was his defining characteristic. The transition was not universally welcomed. McKinley's supporters, particularly Mark Hanna of Ohio, viewed Roosevelt's sudden elevation with something approaching dread. There was a quality to the young president, a restlessness, an imperative toward action, that unsettled the conservative wing of the Republican Party that had, for 3 decades, maintained firm control of the party apparatus. These men had constructed an intricate alliance between business and government, one that had delivered what they perceived as unparalleled prosperity at the turn of the century. They feared that Roosevelt, whom they likened to a bucking bronco, would upset this carefully calibrated arrangement. He was impulsive, they believed, and dangerous in his unpredictability. Yet, Roosevelt moved with surprising caution in his early months. He reassured fiscal conservatives with language designed to calm their fears, stating that the mechanism of modern business is so delicate that extreme care must be taken not to interfere with it in a spirit of rashness or ignorance. It was a masterful performance of restraint, a calculated demonstration that he understood the need for stability. He retained McKinley's cabinet, a gesture meant to signal continuity. And yet, beneath this veneer of continuity lurked Roosevelt's true intention: to establish himself as the master of his party and to position himself as the inevitable nominee in 1904, when his incomplete term would end. Within his first year, however, Roosevelt began to reveal his true colors. In opposing the merger that created the Northern Securities Company, he astonished observers by challenging one of the most powerful figures in American finance, the banker J.P. Morgan. that any president, much less one who had not been elected to his office, would dare to confront such concentrated wealth and power seemed almost reckless. Yet Roosevelt understood something that many of his contemporaries did not, that the exercise of power in the modern age required the appearance of boldness, even when one proceeded with considerable calculation. The concerns that had driven Roosevelt's ascent to the vice presidency, concerns about the distribution of wealth, about the concentration of economic power in too few hands, about the failure of the political system to address the abuses wrought by industrial capitalism, these remained his driving preoccupations. He had come to believe that the 19th century model of laissez-faire economics, one that had allowed entrepreneurs to build vast fortunes through risk and innovation, had given way to a 20th century system in which capitalists reaped enormous rewards while risking little, without some form of redistribution, without some restraint on the appetites of the wealthy. Roosevelt feared that the country would turn toward radicalism or descend into revolution. The system required not the abolition of capitalism, but its reformation, its channeling into healthier directions. This conviction crystallized into what Roosevelt called the Square Deal, a domestic program with three principal aims: the conservation of natural resources, the control of corporations, and the protection of consumers. Unlike the ideological opposition to capitalism that animated the radicals and populists of his era, Roosevelt's approach was fundamentally conservative in its intention. He sought to preserve the capitalist system by reforming it, to avert revolution by introducing just enough change to prevent its necessity. His assault on the trusts became his signature achievement in this regard. He earned the epithet Trustbuster for his aggressive use of the Sherman Antitrust Act, prosecuting 44 antitrust suits during his presidency. His predecessors, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, and William McKinley, had managed only 18 such prosecutions in the aggregate. Yet Roosevelt's approach was not one of blanket opposition to large business combinations. He believed that big business was essential to the American economy. His quarrel was not with size itself, but with the abuses that accompanied it. He distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts, prosecuting those that engaged in practices that restrained trade or imposed unfair prices, while permitting others to exist unmolested. This philosophy was illustrated in his handling of the railroad question. Merchants had long complained that certain railroad rates were excessive, and the question of railroad regulation had become increasingly contentious. When Roosevelt proposed giving the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate these rates, the Senate, led by the conservative Nelson Aldrich, resisted fiercely. Rather than accept defeat, Roosevelt worked across party lines with the Democratic Senator Benjamin Tillman to pass the Hepburn Act of 1906, which granted the IC the power to replace existing rates with just and reasonable maximum rates. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the radicals nor the conservatives, but it represented a significant assertion of federal authority over private commerce. Roosevelt's engagement with issues of food safety and consumer protection revealed the same pragmatic progressivism. When public outrage erupted over conditions in the meatpacking industry, scandals that were given literary form by Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, Roosevelt moved swiftly to push Congress toward reform. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both passed during his presidency, banned misleading labels, harmful chemical preservatives, and adulterated foodstuffs from the nation's commerce. Conservatives had initially opposed such legislation, seeing it as an unwarranted intrusion of government into the sphere of business. But public sentiment, once mobilized, proved irresistible. The question of labor relations posed a different sort of challenge. In May 1902, anthracite coal miners went on strike, threatening to create a national energy shortage as winter approached. This was not a theoretical problem. It was a crisis with immediate and severe consequences for the nation's welfare. Rather than simply siding with capital, as previous presidents had done, Roosevelt summoned both sides to the White House and, after threatening the coal operators with the deployment of federal troops, won their agreement to submit their dispute to arbitration by a commission. The result was a modest but real victory for the miners, who gained increased pay and shorter hours, though they failed to win union recognition. Roosevelt was the first president to intervene directly in a labor dispute, to position himself as an arbiter between capital and labor, rather than as an instrument of one or the other. Yet for all his boldness in domestic affairs, there remained in Roosevelt a deep concern about the limits of executive power. After winning large majorities in the elections of 1902, he had proposed the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which would include a Bureau of Corporations. Congress proved receptive to the department itself, but skeptical of the antitrust powers Roosevelt sought to place within the Bureau. Rather than accept this limitation, Roosevelt appealed directly to the public, pressuring Congress to accept his version of the bill. The tactic worked. Congress overwhelmingly passed legislation that granted Roosevelt what he had sought. Yet even as Roosevelt expanded the reach of executive authority, there was something almost irrepressible about his appetite for intervention. House Speaker Joseph Gurney Cannon, observing Roosevelt's determination to exercise control over nearly every dimension of American life, remarked with some exasperation, "That fellow at the other end of the avenue wants everything from the birth of Christ to the death of the devil." It was not an entirely unjust characterization. Roosevelt attempted to reform the rules of American football, forced the retention of martial arts classes at the Naval Academy, revised disciplinary procedures, altered the design of a coin he disliked, and ordered the simplification of spelling for 300 words in official government documents, a last initiative that he was forced to abandon after ridicule from the press and a formal protest from Congress. The business panic of 1907 tested Roosevelt's philosophy in ways that earlier crises had not. As the stock market entered a steep decline in the early months of 1907, investors and financiers began to blame Roosevelt's regulatory policies for the catastrophe. The proximate cause may have been speculative excess or international instability, but the convenient explanation was that Roosevelt's attacks on corporate malfeasance had created an atmosphere of uncertainty that chilled investment and confidence. By November, Roosevelt was forced to confront the leaders of U.S. Steel, meeting with them on the 4th of the month and, most controversially, approving their plan to purchase a Tennessee steel company that was near bankruptcy. The failure of that company would have triggered the collapse of a major New York bank, a systemic catastrophe that no president could permit. Yet, in the very month before this emergency intervention, Roosevelt had given vent to his deepest convictions about the character of American wealth. In a major speech titled "The Puritan Spirit and the Regulation of Corporations," delivered in August 1907, he had exploded in anger against what he called the malefactors of great wealth, denouncing them with a fury that suggested something more than policy disagreement. He seemed, in those moments, to be expressing a deeply felt moral conviction about the unfitness of the wealthy to govern, about the damage that their activities inflicted on the nation. In the speech itself, he suggested a remarkable possibility that the wealthy, in order to discredit his regulatory policies and force their reversal, had deliberately orchestrated the financial crisis by withdrawing credit and capital from the system. The accusation was almost certainly wrong in its specifics, but it revealed the depth of Roosevelt's suspicion regarding the motivations of concentrated wealth. The contradiction between Roosevelt's pragmatic willingness to approve the U.S. Steel acquisition and his moral condemnation of the malefactors of great wealth remained unresolved. Perhaps he understood, in that intricate calculus of power that characterized his thought, that sometimes one must cooperate with the very forces one opposes, that politics requires a constant negotiation between principle and necessity. Or perhaps the contradiction was real and reflected an oscillation in Roosevelt's thinking between his intellectual conviction that the system required the wealthy to participate in its functioning and his emotional revulsion at the inequalities and injustices that their dominance perpetuated. What is clear is that by the time Roosevelt entered his final years as president, he had become increasingly distrustful of big business, despite the fact that it remained inextricably linked to the Republican Party. He had come to see the problem not as isolated instances of misconduct that might be remedied by individual prosecutions, but as something more systemic, more fundamental. The structure of 20th century capitalism itself seemed to him to generate injustice and inequality. Reform required not merely the punishment of individual malefactors, but a recasting of the fundamental relationship between government and business. This vision would eventually crystallize in his new nationalism, a program that emphasized the priority of labor over capital interests and called for more effective control over corporate creation and combination, including a ban on corporate political contributions. The prosecution of corruption within his own administration revealed another dimension of Roosevelt's approach to power. During his second year in office, scandals emerged involving the Indian Service, the General Land Office, and the Post Office Department. Rather than seeking to minimize or cover up these revelations, Roosevelt moved with decisive speed to address them. He prosecuted corrupt Indian agents who had systematically cheated Native American tribes out of land parcels. In one particularly egregious case involving land fraud and speculation centered on Oregon timberlands, he forced the commissioner of the General Land Office, Binger Herman, from office in November 1902. As special prosecutor, Francis J. Henney obtained 146 indictments in what became known as the Oregon Land Office bribery ring. Roosevelt also prosecuted 44 postal employees on charges of bribery and fraud. Historians have noted that he moved with impressive speed and decisiveness to eradicate the corruption that had taken root in his administration, seemingly viewing it as a threat not merely to good government, but to the legitimacy of his own presidency. Yet even as Roosevelt worked to establish himself as a reformer and trustbuster in the domestic sphere, his true ambitions were increasingly oriented toward the international realm. He was coming to believe, or perhaps he had always believed, and was only now in a position to act upon his convictions, that America's future greatness lay not in the perfection of its internal arrangements, but in its exercise of power on the world stage. The aphorism he had publicized just days before McKinley's assassination took on a new resonance: "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." It was a formulation that seemed almost designed for a leader intent upon the projection of American power globally, upon the transformation of the United States from a continental power into a world power. President and Reformer. Chapter 3. President and Reformer, the work of cleansing his administration, occupied Roosevelt with something approaching fierce necessity. That which had begun in the dark corridors of the Oregon Land Office That complex machinery of bribery, the careful transactions that had left government corrupted from within, demanded the full weight of his reforming attention. 44 postal employees faced charges of bribery and fraud. Each prosecution, each unraveling of a scheme that had taken root in what should have been the incorruptible apparatus of the state, seemed to matter to Roosevelt not merely as an exercise in legal rectitude, but as a test of something more fundamental: the legitimacy of his own presidency itself. Historians have noted the impressive speed and decisiveness with which he moved to eradicate the corruption, as if he understood that whatever damaged the institutions of government damaged the very foundation upon which his authority rested. There was no leisurely accounting, no gradual revelation. The work was done, and done thoroughly, and those who had betrayed the public trust found themselves pursued with an intensity that left little room for compromise or escape. Yet even as Roosevelt bent himself to these domestic corruptions, even as he worked to establish his reputation as a reformer and trustbuster, a different orientation was emerging within him. Or perhaps those who knew him suspected it had always been present, waiting only for the opportunity that the presidency provided. His true ambitions were increasingly, unmistakably oriented toward the international realm. There was a turn occurring in his thinking, a reorientation of the mind toward questions of American power on the world's stage. He had come to believe, or perhaps he had always believed, and was only now in a position to act upon his convictions, that America's future greatness lay not in the perfection of its internal arrangements, but in its exercise of power abroad, in its transformation from a continental power into something grander and more commanding, a world power. The aphorism he had publicized just days before McKinley's death, that quiet utterance about speaking softly while carrying a big stick, took on new resonance in the light of his presidency. It was a formulation that seemed almost designed for a leader intent upon projecting American power across the oceans, reaching into regions where the nation's voice had barely been heard before. This divided attention, the urgent reforming energy at home, coupled with the awakening ambition abroad, would come to define the inattention of his presidency. For alongside the prosecution of the corrupt and the systematic dismantling of monopolistic practices, Roosevelt was beginning to imagine the United States in a wholly different role, not as a nation concerned primarily with the ordering of its own affairs, but as an actor upon a far larger stage, a power among powers, with interests and obligations that spanned the globe. The domestic reforms, however, did not cease. If anything, they intensified. In 1906, responding to public outrage over the revelations of abuse and degradation in the food packing industry, Roosevelt moved Congress toward action. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act represented a deliberate intervention into the practices of American commerce, a declaration that the nation's government had the right and the duty to protect its citizens from adulteration and fraud. It was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published that same year, that galvanized public support for reform. The novel's descriptions of conditions in the stockyards had appalled readers, had made vivid in their minds the intimate connection between the food they placed upon their tables and the corruptions that permitted its production. Conservatives had initially opposed such measures, but Sinclair's words had proven more persuasive than any legislative argument. The acts themselves were direct in their intention. The Meat Inspection Act banned misleading labels and preservatives with harmful chemicals. The Pure Food and Drug Act prohibited impure or falsely labeled food and drugs from being made, sold, and shipped. It was a straightforward declaration, that the government would impose standards, would scrutinize commerce, would protect those who could not protect themselves. Roosevelt seemed to find in this work a kind of satisfaction. His concern extended beyond the immediate reforms. He served as honorary president of the American School Hygiene Association from 1907 to 1908, positioning himself as an advocate for public health and the welfare of children. In 1909, he convened the first White House Conference on the care of dependent children, bringing together experts and officials to consider the plight of those most vulnerable in the nation. There was something in these gestures that spoke to an instinct deeper than mere political calculation, a sense that the vigor and health of the nation depended upon the protection of those most at risk of exploitation or neglect. Yet it was in the realm of conservation that Roosevelt discovered, perhaps his deepest passion and his most abiding achievement. The work of preserving the nation's natural resources and extending federal protection to the land and its creatures became, in his own estimation, the accomplishment he was proudest of. He worked closely with his Interior Secretary James Rudolph Garfield and with Gifford Pinchot, the Chief of the United States Forest Service, to enact a series of conservation programs that met determined resistance from Western Congress members such as Charles William Fulton, men whose constituencies benefited from the unrestricted exploitation of timber and mineral resources. The resistance was not merely political, it was ideological, rooted in a different vision of the nation's development, a different understanding of what constituted progress. But Roosevelt was not deterred. He established the United States Forest Service. He signed the creation of 5 national parks. In 1906, he signed the Antiquities Act, and beneath that authority, proclaimed 18 new national monuments. He established the first 51 bird reserves, 4 game preserves, and 150 national forests. The aggregate area of the United States that he placed under public protection totaled approximately 230 million acres, a vast expanse of the nation secured from private exploitation, withdrawn from the market, dedicated to preservation. He became the first honorary member of the Camp Fire Club of America, a distinction that perhaps pleased him more than any formal honor. His methods, moreover, were characteristically bold. Roosevelt used executive orders extensively to protect forest and wildlife lands, moving without always awaiting congressional approval. By the end of his second term, through executive orders alone, he had reserved 150 million acres of forestry land. He was unapologetic about this assertion of presidential authority, seemingly indifferent to the perception among some members of Congress that he was encroaching upon too many lands, appropriating to the executive branch powers that properly belonged to the legislative. Eventually, Senator Charles Fulton attached an amendment to an agricultural appropriations bill that would prevent any future president from reserving additional federal land. It was a direct rebuke, a legislative constraint imposed on presidential power. But Roosevelt, with characteristic cunning and resolve, proceeded to establish an additional 21 forest reserves before signing the bill into law. He waited until the final moment, until the last possible instant, and then acted. In total, across his presidency, Roosevelt established 121 forest reserves in 31 states through executive orders. The scope of his use of executive authority was, in its way, extraordinary. He issued 1,081 executive orders over the course of his presidency, more than any president who preceded him save Grover Cleveland, who had issued 253. The first 25 presidents combined had issued a total of 1,262. Roosevelt's reliance upon this tool of power, this instrument of presidential will, suggested something about how he conceived his role. The executive order was not merely an administrative convenience. It was a way of acting directly upon the nation, without waiting for the consensus of Congress, without the delays and compromises that legislative process imposed. It was power exercised with minimal friction, power moving through the machinery of government like water finding its course. In 1907, however, Roosevelt encountered a challenge that no exercise of presidential authority could easily resolve. The greatest domestic economic crisis since the Panic of 1893 descended upon the nation. Wall Street's stock market entered into a sharp decline in early 1907, and many investors, particularly those of substantial wealth, blamed Roosevelt's regulatory policies for the collapse in stock prices. The irony was evident to those who cared to observe it. The president who had positioned himself as defender of capital against the unreasonable claims of labor, who had worked to maintain order and stability in the economy, found himself held responsible for the very instability that threatened to engulf the financial system. In August of that year, however, Roosevelt had unleashed a fury of moral condemnation against the super-rich. In a major speech titled "The Puritan Spirit and the Regulation of Corporations," he had exploded in anger at what he termed the malefactors of great wealth. It was a language of moral absolutes, the vocabulary of righteousness applied to commerce and the accumulation of capital. He blamed the crisis in part on Europe, but then, after saluting the unbending rectitude of the Puritans of an earlier age, he proceeded to articulate a suspicion that would seem almost conspiratorial to some ears. It may well be that the determination of the government to punish certain malefactors of great wealth has been responsible for something of the trouble, at least to the extent of having caused these men to combine to bring about as much financial stress as possible, in order to discredit the policy of the government and thereby secure a reversal of that policy, so that they may enjoy unmolested the fruits of their own evil doing. The language revealed Roosevelt's conviction that wickedness was deliberate, that greed was not merely the product of natural human impulse, but of conscious conspiracy. Regarding the wealthy privately, he scorned their entire unfitness to govern the country, their incapacity to understand anything beyond the immediate acquisition of wealth. Yet even as he made these declarations, even as his rhetoric thundered against the malefactors and the corrupt, he found himself, in November 1907, meeting with the leaders of United States Steel, approving their plan to purchase a Tennessee steel company that teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. The company's failure would have ruined a major New York bank, would have cascaded through the financial system with consequences that Roosevelt understood could be catastrophic. The choice before him seemed impossible: permit the financial system to collapse, or permit what appeared to be a consolidation that his trust-busting philosophy opposed. He chose to permit the acquisition, and in doing so found himself caught in the very contradiction that his critics would seize upon. Here was the reformer, the scourge of monopoly, approving a move that strengthened the very kind of corporate combination he had made it his mission to oppose. The crisis passed, or at least passed from its most acute phase, but the contradiction remained, unresolved and troubling. Eschen and Kermit. Roosevelt's malaria worsened during the journey, and at one point he became delirious and considered ending his life rather than continuing to be a burden on the expedition. His son's devotion and the team's determination to proceed kept Roosevelt moving forward. The fever eventually subsided, though it left him weakened for the remainder of the journey. The expedition faced formidable challenges beyond Roosevelt's illness. The group encountered hostile indigenous peoples, navigated treacherous rapids, and endured the relentless demands of the jungle environment. Food supplies ran dangerously low at various points, and the team was forced to rely on hunting and foraging to sustain themselves. Despite these hardships, Roosevelt maintained a naturalist's keen eye for observation, collecting specimens and documenting the flora and fauna they encountered. The journey lasted several months, and by the time the expedition reached the mouth of the river on April 27, 1914, Roosevelt had lost considerable weight and remained in fragile health. Nonetheless, he emerged from the Brazilian wilderness with journals filled with scientific observations and a narrative that would captivate readers upon publication. The Roosevelt River, as it came to be known, represented both a geographical discovery and a personal test of the former president's physical endurance and mental fortitude. Though Roosevelt had proven himself throughout his life as a man of vigor and action, this expedition demonstrated the toll that age and illness could exact even upon one possessed of his legendary constitution. The journey also underscored his enduring commitment to scientific inquiry and exploration, pursuits that had animated his thinking since his youth. Upon returning to the United States, Roosevelt began the work of organizing his notes and preparing the manuscript that would become Through the Brazilian Wilderness, a testament to both the adventure itself and to Roosevelt's capacity to transform personal experience into literary and scientific contribution. Roosevelt's return to America in 1914 found the nation and the world in a state of profound flux. The Great War had erupted in Europe in August of that year, and the question of American involvement would soon dominate political discourse. Roosevelt, energized by his expedition despite his lingering physical weakness, found himself drawn back into the currents of national politics with characteristic intensity. His time abroad and in the wilderness had provided distance from the immediate partisan struggles that had consumed him during the Taft years. Yet, it had not diminished his conviction that he possessed insights essential to the nation's welfare. The schism within the Republican Party that had widened during the Taft administration remained unhealed. Roosevelt's supporters continued to view him as the authentic voice of progressivism, while conservatives regarded him with deep suspicion. The 1912 election had seen Roosevelt's bolt from the party to form the Progressive or Bull Moose Party, a dramatic and ultimately unsuccessful bid to reclaim the presidency. Though he had received more votes than Taft in that election, the split Republican vote had handed victory to the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Now in 1914, as war consumed Europe and questions about American preparedness and neutrality became paramount, Roosevelt found himself increasingly at odds with the Wilson administration's approach to these questions. Roosevelt's foreign policy perspective, forged during his presidency and refined through years of reflection and international observation, rested on a clear-eyed assessment of national power and interest. He believed that the United States, possessed of great economic and military potential, had a responsibility to shape events rather than to be shaped by them. The notion of progressive international reform through arbitration and legal instruments, which Taft had championed, seemed to Roosevelt naive and potentially dangerous. Roosevelt had argued strenuously during his European tour in 1910 that great questions of state could not be resolved through legal mechanisms alone. They required the application of power, backed by military strength and the will to use it. As war raged in Europe, Roosevelt became increasingly convinced that American interests and moral obligations aligned in support of the British and French against Germany. He viewed German militarism as a threat not merely to European stability, but to American security and the future of democratic civilization. This conviction grew stronger as the war progressed, and as accounts emerged of German conduct toward neutral nations and civilian populations. Roosevelt's rhetoric became increasingly forceful in calling for American preparedness and, eventually, for American intervention on the side of the Allies. He castigated President Wilson for what he perceived as weakness and indecision, arguing that the president's policy of neutrality was neither tenable nor moral given the stakes involved. Roosevelt's political activities during the Wilson years were constrained by his age and by the changed political landscape. Though he remained a commanding figure in American public life, the Progressive Party that he had led in 1912 had largely dissolved. Many progressives had drifted back to the Republican Party or had been drawn into the Wilson administration's orbit. Roosevelt found himself in an anomalous position, revered by many for his past accomplishments and respected for the vigor of his opinions, yet lacking the formal political power to implement his views. He channeled his energies into writing, speaking, and attempting to influence Republican strategy through his close associates and through the editorial pages of the Outlook magazine. The question of preparedness consumed much of Roosevelt's attention during the years before American entry into the war. He had long advocated for a strong military establishment, viewing it not as an instrument of aggression, but as a necessary foundation for national security and as a deterrent to those who might contemplate challenging American interests. As the European war ground on with seemingly no end in sight, Roosevelt became an increasingly vocal advocate for the United States to prepare itself militarily for the possibility that neutrality might not be tenable. He pushed for increased defense spending, for the modernization of the armed forces, and for programs that would ensure that American youth were trained in the martial virtues that he believed essential to national survival. This advocacy for preparedness put Roosevelt at odds not only with the Wilson administration, but with many Americans who feared that preparing for war would lead inevitably to war. Pacifist sentiment remained strong in parts of the nation, and many Americans, particularly in the Midwest and West, were deeply reluctant to see the country drawn into what they viewed as a European conflict with no direct bearing on American security. Roosevelt, however, argued that isolationism was itself a form of weakness, that it invited predatory powers to act without fear of American resistance. He contended that the surest way to avoid war was to be so well prepared and so clearly resolved to defend American interests that potential adversaries would think twice before challenging the nation. Throughout these years, Roosevelt's conception of American duty and American power remained consistent with the views he had articulated during his presidency. He believed that the United States had emerged from the Spanish-American War and its industrial development as a great power, with all the responsibilities that such status entailed. The notion that America could somehow remain aloof from the great contests shaping the international order seemed to him fantastical. The world was, in his view, a realm of conflict and competition among nations, and America's role was to ensure that its interests and values were protected and advanced within that competitive realm. This realist assessment of international relations, though it was sometimes clothed in the language of moral obligation and democratic principle, reflected his fundamental conviction that nations acted ultimately in pursuit of their own interests, and that the wise statesman was one who understood this reality clearly and acted accordingly. Roosevelt's activities during the Wilson years also reflected his continuing engagement with intellectual and cultural matters. He maintained his interest in natural history and conservation, though he could no longer directly influence policy as he had during his presidency. He remained a prolific author, producing numerous articles and books that allowed him to reach a wide audience. His correspondence with leading figures in American politics, letters that were often forceful and sometimes acerbic, kept him connected to the networks of power and influence, even when he himself held no official position. The personal toll of Roosevelt's political struggles and his strenuous activities should not be overlooked. Though he maintained a facade of vigor and remained remarkably active for a man entering his 50s and then his 60s, his health was not what it once had been. The malaria contracted during the Brazilian expedition lingered in his system, occasionally flaring up and weakening him. The emotional toll of his break with Taft and the failure of the Progressive Party venture had been significant, and while Roosevelt maintained his characteristic optimism and resilience, those close to him noted that he was not untouched by disappointment and frustration at being excluded from power. Yet Roosevelt's essential nature remained unchanged. He continued to believe that action and engagement with life's great contests were preferable to withdrawal and passivity. He continued to trust in the capacity of the American people to meet challenges and to uphold democratic values when called upon to do so. And he continued to believe that his own voice and counsel, born from decades of experience and reflection, remained valuable contributions to the nation's deliberations about its future course. As the World War continued and the question of American involvement drew ever closer to resolution, Roosevelt stood ready to participate in that great national debate, armed with convictions formed through a lifetime of thought and action, and determined to influence the nation's course in accordance with his vision of American duty and national interest. Decline and Legacy. Chapter 4. Decline and Legacy. In the years that followed his return from Africa and Europe in the early summer of 1910, Theodore Roosevelt found himself in a peculiar and unwelcome position, that of an elder statesman without clear place or purpose in the nation's political machinery. The Africa he had traversed, the capitals of Europe he had graced with his presence, had seemed to restore something of the vigor and sense of engagement that the presidency's end had threatened to diminish. Yet the homecoming itself brought swift disillusionment. The 1910 elections, for which Roosevelt had campaigned vigorously on behalf of Republican candidates, had resulted in Democratic gains of historic proportion. For the first time since 1892, the Democrats held control of the House of Representatives. Among the newly elected officials was a young state senator from New York, a distant cousin bearing Roosevelt's own name, who had the audacity to argue that he, Franklin D. Roosevelt, represented his kinsman's own progressive principles more faithfully than the Republican Party itself could claim to do. It was a peculiar wound to receive. This suggestion that another, younger Roosevelt had better understood and captured the spirit of reform that the former president believed he had championed. The defeat prompted serious reflection among the progressive wing of the Republican Party. Senator Robert M. La Follette, working alongside the forester Gifford Pinchot, the journalist William White, and California Governor Hiram Johnson, began to organize what they termed the National Progressive Republican League in 1911. Their stated objectives were ambitious: to dismantle the power of political bosses at the state level and to prevent President Taft's renomination at the national level. Roosevelt, despite harboring skepticism about the League itself, expressed general sympathy for the progressive principles upon which it was founded. Between January and April of 1911, he contributed a series of articles to The Outlook, the journal of which he was now an editor, defending what he called the great movement of our day, the progressive nationalist movement against special privilege, and in favor of an honest and efficient political and industrial democracy. These were the words of a man still convinced of his own relevance, still certain that his voice carried weight and moral authority in the nation's councils. Yet they were also the words of a man who, for the moment at least, professed no interest in returning to the presidency himself. La Follette, interpreting this apparent reluctance as opening the field to his own ambitions, declared his candidacy for the presidency in June 1911. But Roosevelt, observing the senator's campaign with a mixture of assessment and irritation, began to voice increasingly sharp criticisms of President Taft. The final rupture between the two men came in September 1911, when the Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against United States Steel. For Roosevelt, this action carried particular sting, for he had personally approved the very acquisition that the government was now challenging in court. The humiliation of this reversal, to have his own judgment questioned, his authority in such matters undermined, proved a catalyst that his previous reservations could not withstand. Even so, Roosevelt remained, through 1911 and into 1912, unwilling to declare himself a candidate to oppose Taft directly. He harbored instead a different hope: to run against whichever Democrat prevailed in the general election, postponing his political resurrection to 1916. Yet the immediate question of power and principle could not be so easily deferred. The matter that crystallized this uncertainty concerned not domestic politics, but the ancient and vexing question of how nations should resolve their disputes. In 1911, President Taft and his Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, had negotiated treaties with Britain and France providing for the arbitration of international differences. These disputes would be submitted, under the terms of the agreements, either to the Hague Court or to another impartial tribunal. The treaties had been signed in August, but they required ratification by a 2/3 vote of the Senate, a requirement that neither Taft nor Knox had seen fit to consult Senate leadership about during the negotiation process. By the time the issue came before the Senate in late 1911, many Republicans, alienated from Taft by various grievances, were disposed to oppose his initiatives. The President, sensing this hostility and fearing that vigorous lobbying for the treaties might prove counterproductive, made speeches supporting them in October, but he made no sustained push. The Senate, meanwhile, began to attach amendments to the treaties, conditions that Taft found unacceptable. In the end, the amended treaties died. Behind this parliamentary failure lay a genuine and searching dispute about the nature of peace and the prevention of war, a division that cut across party lines and revealed something profound about the competing philosophies among America's progressive thinkers. Taft, the constitutional lawyer with his deep grounding in legal theory, viewed arbitration as the most promising alternative to warfare. His base of support came from the conservative business community that had embraced peace movements in the years before 1914. These men of commerce and capital believed that economic rivalries bred conflict, and that therefore a world bound together by trade and mutual economic interest would naturally resist the expense and futility of war. They had failed, however, to mobilize themselves effectively on behalf of the treaties, and the opportunity had slipped away. In opposition to this line of thinking stood Roosevelt and his close ally in the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge. Roosevelt ridiculed arbitration as foolhardy idealism, the product of wishful thinking, disconnected from the hard realities of international power. Where Taft saw law as the solution, Roosevelt saw history and the nature of nations themselves. The serious disputes that divided great powers, in Roosevelt's conviction, could not be resolved through panels and courts. They required something more fundamental, more primal. Roosevelt worked actively with Lodge to introduce the very amendments that killed the treaties, a deliberate act of sabotage against Taft's campaign platform. At a deeper level, beneath the political calculation, lay Roosevelt's genuine philosophical conviction. He truly believed that arbitration was naive, that great international questions had to be decided by war, and that war itself, properly understood, possessed an ennobling, even transcendent quality. This Rooseveltian view incorporated what might be called a near-mystical faith in the elevating power of martial conflict. It endorsed a jingoistic nationalism, a love of national greatness and power for its own sake, as opposed to the businessmen's more calculating assessment of profit and national interest. Here was revealed something essential in Roosevelt's inner nature, a romantic vision of human striving and national destiny that transcended mere material advantage. It was during this same period of domestic political turmoil that Roosevelt had embarked upon and completed his great expeditions of exploration and scientific research. In March 1909, the former president departed for the African continent, leading what was officially designated the Smithsonian Roosevelt African Expedition. The party landed at Mombasa in East Africa and proceeded on a journey of remarkable scope and ambition through the Belgian Congo, along the Nile River to Khartoum in the Sudan, a path that would occupy nearly a year of his life. The expedition had been financed generously by the industrialist Andrew Carnegie and by Roosevelt's own prolific writings. The scientific team included naturalists and experts from both the Smithsonian Institution and the American Museum of Natural History. Among the participants were Roosevelt's son Kermit, the famed big game hunter and explorer Frederick Selous, the hunter-tracker R.J. Cunningham, who served as guide, and naturalists including Edgar Alexander Mearns, Edmund Heller, and John Alden Loring. Together, this company pursued a systematic and thorough collection of specimens for America's great museums. The sheer scale of the hunting operation reflected the scientific ambitions of the age and the particular vision of preservation that animated museums of the period. The expedition killed or trapped approximately 11,400 animals, ranging from insects and moles to the great mammals, hippopotamuses, giraffes, rhinoceroses, and elephants. Among the larger animals taken were 512 specimens of big game, including 6 rare white rhinoceroses. Tons of salted carcasses and hides were shipped back to Washington, where the work of mounting and preserving them would occupy museum staff for years to come, when later critics raised questions about the scale of this taking. Roosevelt responded with a formulation that both defended the practice and revealed something of his utilitarian philosophy. I can be condemned only if the existence of the National Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, and all similar zoological institutions are to be condemned. The great repositories of knowledge and natural history, in his view, justified the means by which they were stocked. He documented the entire journey in meticulous detail in his book, African Game Trails, a volume that combined scientific observation, hunting adventure, and reflective commentary on the lands he traversed. Following the African safari, Roosevelt had sailed northward to undertake a tour of Europe of considerable diplomatic and intellectual significance. In Egypt, stopping first, he commented favorably on British rule, observing that the nation was not yet prepared for independence. He declined, however, to meet with the Pope, a refusal prompted by a dispute concerning a group of Methodist missionaries active in Rome, a small incident that suggested something of Roosevelt's complex relationship to religious authority and sectarian matters. He was received by the great monarchs of Europe, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and King George I of Britain, among others. In Oslo, he delivered a notable address calling for limitations on naval armaments, a strengthening of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the creation of what he termed a League of Peace among the world powers. He spoke at Oxford, delivering the Romanes lecture, where he rejected those who sought to draw parallels between the evolution of animal life and the development of human society. A defense of human dignity and distinctiveness that reflected his deeper philosophical commitments. Yet even as Roosevelt moved through the capitals of Europe in a haze of receptions and state dinners, even as he presented himself to the world as the representative of American power and civilization, he was quietly gathering information about the growing dissatisfactions with the Taft administration at home. He met privately with Gifford Pinchot, the forester, who had been his ally and collaborator, and learned from Pinchot of his own forced resignation from the position of head of the Forest Service. Pinchot had clashed with Richard Ballinger, Taft's Secretary of the Interior, and had been removed from office. These conversations, conducted in the shadowed drawing rooms of European hotels, planted seeds of grievance and reinforcement for Roosevelt's own developing sense of betrayal. He returned to the United States in June 1910, and 4 months later, in October of that year, he became the first president of the United States to fly in an airplane, a brief journey of 4 minutes in a craft designed by the Wright brothers. A gesture toward modernity that somehow seemed fitting for a man who had always positioned himself at the forefront of national progress and innovation. The African and European journeys had been financed partly through Roosevelt's own literary earnings, but substantially through the generosity of Andrew Carnegie, the aging steel magnate who had become interested in Roosevelt's scientific and exploratory pursuits. In return for this patronage, Carnegie had asked Roosevelt to undertake a delicate diplomatic mission to mediate the growing tensions between the cousins who ruled Britain and Germany, King Edward VII and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Roosevelt had begun to engage in this effort, but the scheme collapsed suddenly and unexpectedly when King Edward VII died. The loss of this potential role as mediator between the great powers of Europe was a disappointment that Roosevelt bore with characteristic resilience, but it also marked the limits of his influence over events that would shortly consume the attention of all the great nations. In the years between 1913 and 1914, Roosevelt embarked upon yet another expedition, this time to South America. The genesis of this journey lay in an invitation extended years earlier by John Augustine Zahm, a friend and associate, who had asked Roosevelt to help plan a research expedition to the South American continent. To finance the venture, Roosevelt obtained support from the American Museum of Natural History, pledging in return to bring back new specimens for their collections. The expedition itself, which he would later chronicle in his book Through the Brazilian Wilderness, proved to be a journey of extraordinary difficulty and danger, one that would mark a turning point in his declining physical vigor. The party departed for the Brazilian interior in 1913 with the intention of exploring and mapping previously unknown territory. Roosevelt's son Kermit accompanied him, as did the Brazilian explorer Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, after whom the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition was named. The naturalist George Kruk Cherry, a Brazilian military officer named Lieutenant Ju Lira, The team physician Jos Antonio Cajazera, and some 16 skilled paddlers and porters made up the remainder of the company. The initial expedition began on December 9, 1913, at the height of the rainy season, an inauspicious time that would presage the difficulties to come. The descent of the Duvida River, which Roosevelt's party intended to trace northward to the Madeira and thence to the Amazon, did not commence until February 27, 1914. It was during this descent that Roosevelt sustained a leg wound, an injury he received while attempting to prevent the expedition's canoes from being dashed against rocks in treacherous rapids. The wound itself was minor at first, merely a flesh wound in the leg, but in the humid, disease-laden environment of the jungle, the injury quickly became infected. The infection gave him a tropical fever that resembled the malaria he had contracted during his time in Cuba years before. As the weeks of the journey progressed, the fever weakened him with increasing severity. 6 weeks into the descent, he had become so debilitated that he required constant attendance from the expedition's physician and from his son Kermit. He could no longer walk, handicapped not only by the infected leg, but also by an infirmity in his other leg, a consequence of a traffic accident that had occurred a decade earlier. His chest pains increased, and his fever climbed to 103 degrees Fahrenheit, bringing with it delirium and the dissolution of his faculties. Faced with his own physical collapse and mindful that his weakness was imperiling the survival of the entire party, which was inadequately provisioned, Roosevelt made the decision that perhaps revealed the deepest current of his character. He insisted that he be left behind so that the others might proceed with a better chance of survival. He even made preparations to end his own life with morphine, rather than become a burden to his companions and a threat to their chances of escape. It was the intervention of his son Kermit alone that convinced him to continue, that kept him from surrendering to what seemed like the inevitable conclusion of his life in the jungle. Kermit's refusal to abandon his father, his insistence on perseverance despite the seemingly insurmountable odds, represented a kind of familial love and loyalty that penetrated Roosevelt's despair. As the expedition continued its slow descent of the river, Roosevelt's physical decline became ever more apparent. He lost 50 pounds from his already robust frame. The team's pace slowed considerably as Colonel Rondon reduced their speed to allow for the detailed map-making and astronomical observations necessary to fix their position by the sun. When Roosevelt finally returned to New York, friends and family members who saw him were startled and disturbed by his appearance and the profound fatigue that seemed to have settled into his very being. To a friend, he wrote words that seemed to carry a premonition of his approaching end. The jungle journey, he said, had cut his life short by 10 years. From that point forward, for what would prove to be the remaining 5 years of his existence, he would be subject to recurring bouts of malaria and inflammations of the leg so severe as to require surgical intervention. Even before Roosevelt had completed his voyage home to New York, critics and skeptics had begun to question his claims regarding the expedition. They doubted whether he had truly explored and successfully navigated a completely uncharted river, more than 625 miles in length. Roosevelt, when his health had sufficiently recovered, addressed a convention organized by the National Geographic Society in Washington, a standing room only gathering before which he successfully defended his claims and vindicated his accomplishments. The validation, however, could not restore what the jungle had taken from him. Through all these journeys and expeditions, Roosevelt had continued to be, as he had been throughout his adult life, a man of extraordinary literary productivity, His pen seemed never to rest. He wrote with passionate intensity on subjects ranging from foreign policy to the preservation of the natural world, from the history of the American frontier to reflections on the character of nations. He was also, those who knew him observed, an avid reader of poetry, one who could quote verse with ease and appreciation. The poet Robert Frost, who knew Roosevelt, remarked of him, "He was our kind. He quoted poetry to me. He knew poetry." It was not the image that the public held of the man, the rough rider, the big game hunter, the warrior, but it spoke to something real in Roosevelt's inner life, a responsiveness to beauty and artistic expression that coexisted with his strenuous outdoor pursuits. As the editor of The Outlook, a position he had assumed after leaving the presidency, Roosevelt enjoyed weekly access to a large and educated national audience. He would ultimately author approximately 18 books, each published in multiple editions, ranging from his autobiography to The Rough Riders, his account of his military service in Cuba, to the history of the Naval War of 1812, to volumes on ranching, exploration, and wildlife. His most ambitious literary undertaking was the 4-volume narrative The Winning of the West, a sweeping account of the American frontier in the 18th and early 19th centuries. In this work, Roosevelt advanced his interpretation of American history as the story of the emergence of a new American race from the heroic hunters and Indian fighters who had settled the wilderness with minimal aid from government. These writings were not merely political or polemical. They represented Roosevelt's genuine effort to understand the nation's past and to locate within that history the sources of American character and strength. In 1905, Roosevelt had become embroiled in a widely publicized literary controversy that would occupy his attention and energies for some time. A few years earlier, the naturalist John Burroughs had published an essay in the Atlantic Monthly entitled Real and Sham Natural History, in which he attacked popular writers of the day, Ernest Thompson Seton, Charles G. Dee, Roberts, William J. Long, for their fantastical and anthropomorphic representations of wildlife. Roosevelt, agreeing with Burroughs's criticisms, had published several essays of his own, denouncing what he called the yellow journalism of the woods, the proliferation of so-called naturalistic animal stories that attributed human emotions and motives to animal characters with reckless disregard for scientific accuracy. It was Roosevelt himself who popularized the term nature faker to describe these writers and their methods. The controversy revealed something of Roosevelt's commitment to factual accuracy and scientific truth, even as it showed his willingness to engage in the give and take of literary debate with fellow writers and critics. Chapter 4. Decline, and Legacy, the controversy over nature fakers, had revealed something essential in Roosevelt's intellectual makeup: a commitment to factual accuracy and scientific truth that would persist throughout his remaining years. Yet even as he defended the integrity of naturalistic observation, Roosevelt himself was embarking upon the grandest adventures of his post-presidential life, expeditions that would test not only his powers of description, but his very physical constitution. These journeys, undertaken with characteristic vigor and ambition, would gradually exhaust the formidable reservoir of energy that had sustained him through decades of public service. In the spring of 1909, scarcely a month after leaving office, Roosevelt departed for Africa. The Smithsonian Roosevelt African Expedition represented the fulfillment of a long-held dream to see the African wilderness and to contribute scientific knowledge to American institutions. well financed by the industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and by Roosevelt's own prolific writings. The expedition was no mere hunting excursion, but a serious zoological endeavor. The party, numbering among its members his son Kermit and various naturalists including Edgar Alexander Mearns, Edmund Heller, and John Alden Loring, was led by the renowned hunter-tracker R.J. Cunningham and included Frederick Selous, celebrated as both big game hunter and explorer. Landing at Mombasa in East Africa, the expedition traversed the Belgian Congo before following the Nile River northward to Khartoum, in what is now Sudan. The scale of the collecting operation was staggering. Over the course of the safari, Roosevelt's party killed or trapped some 11,400 animals, ranging from the smallest insects and moles to massive hippopotamuses and elephants. Among the 1,000 larger specimens taken were 512 big game animals, including 6 rare white rhinoceroses. The carefully preserved carcasses and skins, salted for preservation, were shipped in considerable tonnage to Washington, where the work of mounting and preserving them would occupy museum specialists for years to come. When critics later questioned the propriety of such wholesale collecting, Roosevelt defended himself with characteristic directness, asserting that I can be condemned only if the existence of the National Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, and all similar zoological institutions are to be condemned. It was a formulation that acknowledged the tension between conservation and scientific collecting, between preservation and advancement of knowledge. From Africa, Roosevelt traveled northward to embark upon an extended tour of Europe, a journey that would allow him to observe contemporary politics and statecraft firsthand, while remaining, at least nominally, removed from American partisan disputes. In Egypt, he paused to comment favorably upon British administration, declaring that the country was not yet prepared for independence. He refused an audience with the Pope, a decision prompted by a dispute over a group of Methodist missionaries active in Rome, a small incident that revealed how thoroughly the concerns of American religious communities traveled with him, even to the capitals of Europe. His meetings with the great monarchs and statesmen of the continent were numerous and consequential. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary received him, as did Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and King George V of Great Britain, along with various other leaders whose kingdoms and republics comprised the European order. In Oslo, Roosevelt delivered a speech that outlined his vision of international order, a vision both progressive in its aspirations and rooted in his pragmatic understanding of power. He called for limitations on naval armaments, for a strengthening of the permanent court of arbitration, and for the creation of what he termed a League of Peace among the world powers, an institution that would prove prophetic of later developments in international organization. At Oxford University, where he delivered the prestigious Romanes lecture, he took the opportunity to denounce those who sought crude parallels between the evolution of animal life and the development of human society. Returning to his fundamental commitment to scientific accuracy and against the distortions of Darwinian thought that had been pressed into service of various ideological ends. Throughout his European sojourn, Roosevelt attempted to maintain the fiction of remaining aloof from domestic American politics. Yet, he could not entirely insulate himself from the currents swirling within his own party. It was during this tour that he met quietly with Gifford Pinchot, his former chief of the Forest Service, who poured out his disappointment with the Taft administration. Pinchot had been forced to resign his position following a bitter clash with Richard Ballinger, the Secretary of the Interior under President Taft. The seeds of Roosevelt's future rupture with his successor were thus planted during these European conversations, watered by the accumulated grievances of the progressive Republicans whom Roosevelt had trusted and appointed. Roosevelt returned to the United States in June of 1910, his African and European adventures behind him. 4 months after his homecoming, in October of that year, he achieved another distinction when he became the first former president to fly in an airplane, ascending in a Wright brothers designed craft for a flight that lasted 4 minutes. The feat was typical of Roosevelt's eagerness to embrace the modern and the novel, his refusal to be bound by the conventions that usually constrained men of his age and station. The relationship between Roosevelt and Andrew Carnegie, which had financed the African expedition, proved more complicated than might have appeared on the surface. According to later historical analysis, Carnegie had sought to secure Roosevelt's assistance in mediating a growing conflict between the cousins who ruled Britain and Germany, King Edward VII and Kaiser Wilhelm II, a dispute that threatened the peace of Europe and the stability of the global order. Roosevelt undertook preliminary efforts in this direction, but the scheme collapsed unexpectedly when King Edward VII died with sudden abruptness. The historian David Nassau has argued that Roosevelt systematically deceived and manipulated the elderly Carnegie throughout their association, and that the ex-president held the industrialist in contempt despite the generous financial support he had provided. Such an interpretation, if accurate, would suggest depths of duplicity and manipulation in Roosevelt's character that complicate the popular image of straightforward vigor and honesty. Even as Roosevelt toured Europe and Africa, the political situation at home was deteriorating from the perspective of the progressive wing of the Republican Party. When the midterm elections of 1910 were held, the Republicans suffered significant defeats, and the Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time since 1892. Among the newly elected Democrats was a young New York State senator named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Theodore, who boldly argued that he, rather than the Republican candidate, better represented the policies and principles of his more famous relative. The irony was not lost on observers. The Roosevelt name itself had become a battleground in American politics. The progressive Republicans who had supported Roosevelt interpreted these electoral defeats as compelling evidence that the party required fundamental reorganization. In 1911, Senator Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin, along with Gifford Pinchot, the editor William Allen White, and California Governor Hiram Johnson, joined forces to create the National Progressive Republican League. Their dual objectives were to root out the power of political bossism at the state level and to effect the replacement of President Taft at the national level before the 1912 election. Roosevelt expressed skepticism about some aspects of the League's approach, yet he gave general support to its progressive principles. Between January and April of 1911, Roosevelt contributed a series of articles to the Outlook magazine in which he defended what he called the great movement of our day, the progressive nationalist movement against special privilege, and in favor of an honest and efficient political and industrial democracy. The language was ardent and uncompromising, revealing that despite his protestations of non-involvement, Roosevelt remained deeply engaged with the ideological and political struggles that defined American progressivism. Yet Roosevelt's own plans for 1912 remained opaque. With Roosevelt apparently unwilling to throw his hat into the presidential ring, La Follette announced his own candidacy in June of 1911, stepping forward as the progressive alternative to the incumbent president. Roosevelt continued to level criticism against Taft throughout the latter months of 1910 and into 1911, but he harbored hopes that he might run in 1916 against whichever Democrat emerged victorious against Taft in the coming election. It was an audacious calculation, the belief that he might recapture the presidency after a 4-year interval. But it reflected his confidence in his own political salience and his conviction that he represented the true direction of American political development. The break between Roosevelt and Taft became final and irreparable in September of 1911, when the Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against United States Steel. The case struck Roosevelt with personal force, for he had himself, while president, personally approved the very acquisition that the Justice Department was now challenging in court. The humiliation was profound, and the betrayal, as Roosevelt perceived it, complete. Taft, or at least Taft's Attorney General, had taken action that seemed to repudiate Roosevelt's own judgment and to place the ex-president in the position of having abetted corporate malfeasance. The wound went deep, and the reconciliation that might have been possible in earlier disagreements became impossible. The question of international arbitration revealed another dimension of the fracture between Roosevelt and the administration. Taft, seeking to establish his credentials as a world leader devoted to the cause of peace, had negotiated treaties with Britain and France in 1911 that provided for the arbitration of differences between the nations. Under the terms of these treaties, disputes would be submitted to the Hague Court or to another tribunal designated by the parties. The treaties were signed in August of 1911, but they required ratification by a 2/3 vote of the United States Senate, a threshold that Taft and his Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, had failed to secure through prior consultation with Senate leaders. By the time the treaties reached the Senate, many Republicans had grown disenchanted with Taft, and the president hesitated to lobby too forcefully for their ratification, fearing that such efforts might actually precipitate their defeat. In October, Taft made speeches in support of the treaties, but the Senate added amendments that the president found unacceptable, and the treaties died. The arbitration controversy revealed a fundamental division among American progressives. One faction, led by Taft, looked to arbitration as the best available alternative to the scourge of warfare. Taft, a trained constitutional lawyer with deep understanding of legal questions, drew his political base from the conservative business community that had long supported peace movements before the outbreak of World War. These businessmen believed that economic rivalry was the root cause of war, and that international trade created an interdependent world economy that made warfare prohibitively expensive and therefore essentially useless. Yet an opposing faction, led by Roosevelt, ridiculed the arbitration movement as foolhardy idealism divorced from the hard realities of international relations. Roosevelt insisted, with characteristic fervor, that arbitration could not resolve serious disputes between nations. Only war, that ultimate arbiter, could decide matters of genuine importance. Roosevelt worked in concert with his close friend Senator Henry Cabot Lodge to impose amendments to the arbitration treaties that would ensure their rejection. In so doing, he was acting, at least in part, to sabotage Taft's campaign promises and to demonstrate the bankruptcy of the president's foreign policy approach. Yet beneath this partisan motivation lay a deeper conviction, one that had animated Roosevelt's thought throughout his career. He truly believed that arbitration was a naive solution to the great questions that divided nations, and that such questions could only be resolved through the test of war. The Rooseveltian worldview incorporated what might be called a near-mystical faith in the ennobling and purifying character of war. It endorsed a jingoistic nationalism but stood in sharp contrast to the businessmen's more calculating assessment of profit and national interest. Roosevelt had never doubted that war could bring out the highest qualities in men, and he viewed peace, especially prolonged peace, with something approaching suspicion. The year 1913 brought another grand adventure into Roosevelt's life, one that would test his physical constitution even more severely than the African expedition. A friend of long-standing John Augustine Zahm had invited Roosevelt several years earlier to help plan a research expedition to South America. To finance the venture, Roosevelt secured support from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, pledging to return with new specimens for their collections. The result was the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition, so named after its two leaders, Roosevelt and the Brazilian explorer and naturalist Cândido Mariano da Silva Rondon, which would take Roosevelt into the unexplored reaches of the Brazilian jungle. The expedition would later be memorialized in Roosevelt's book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness, which would document not only the discoveries made, but the harrowing trials endured. The original plan had called for a more modest exploration, but once in South America, a more ambitious objective took shape. The expedition would attempt to locate the headwaters of the Rio de Vida, trace that river to its junction with the Madeira, and then follow the Madeira to its confluence with the Amazon. The de Vida would later be renamed the Rio Roosevelt in recognition of the expedition's achievement. Roosevelt's party consisted of a small but capable group: his son Kermit, Colonel Cândido Rondon, the American naturalist George Kruk Cherry, a Brazilian military officer named Ju Lira, the expedition physician Jos Antonio Cajazera, and some 16 skilled paddlers and porters to manage the canoes and supplies. The expedition began under inauspicious circumstances on December 9th, 1913, at the height of the rainy season in Brazil, when the rivers were swollen and treacherous. The actual descent of the Rio de Vida commenced on February 27, 1914, and it was during this phase of the journey that disaster nearly overtook the expedition. Roosevelt, ever willing to place himself in the thick of danger, jumped into the river in an attempt to prevent the expedition's canoes from dashing themselves against the rocks. In doing so, he sustained a flesh wound that seemed minor at the time, but proved calamitous in its consequences. The wound became infected, and the infection metastasized into a tropical fever that resembled closely the malaria he had contracted during his time in Cuba years before. As the infection spread through his body, Roosevelt's condition deteriorated with alarming rapidity. 6 weeks into the journey, he had become so weakened that the expedition's physician and his son Kermit were required to attend to him constantly. His other leg, damaged in a traffic accident a decade earlier, began to cause him additional pain and disability. He developed chest pains of alarming intensity, and his fever soared to 103 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to produce delirium and to place his life in genuine jeopardy. Regarding his condition as a threat to the survival of the entire expedition, which was perilously short of provisions, Roosevelt insisted that he be left behind so that the others might proceed to safety. He even prepared to take his own life with morphine, rather than become a burden to those who depended upon him. Only an emotional appeal from his son Kermit persuaded him to continue living and to remain with the expedition. Despite Roosevelt's continuing physical decline and the loss of some 50 pounds from his already lean frame, Colonel Rondon reduced the pace of the expedition to allow time for careful map-making. The work of surveying their position by sun-based observations required regular stops, and these pauses at least allowed Roosevelt some respite from the rigors of travel. When Roosevelt finally returned to New York after his long sea voyage home, friends and family members were startled and dismayed by his altered appearance and evident physical exhaustion. Roosevelt himself, in correspondence with a friend, wrote what proved to be a prophetic assessment of the expedition's cost. It had, he believed, cut 10 years from his life. For the remainder of his years, which would now number only 5, Roosevelt would be subject to recurring bouts of malaria and to inflammatory conditions of his legs so severe that they would eventually require surgical intervention. Even before Roosevelt had completed his voyage home, critics had begun to voice skepticism about his claims regarding the exploration and navigation of an entirely uncharted river more than 625 miles in length. The accusations stung the ex-president, who had built his reputation partly on his credibility as an observer and explorer. When his health had improved sufficiently, Roosevelt addressed a packed convention organized in Washington by the National Geographic Society, and in that forum, he successfully defended his claims, providing sufficient evidence and documentation to satisfy the assembled experts and to vindicate his reputation. Throughout his declining years, Roosevelt's prolific output as a writer continued undiminished. He was a man of passionate intellectual engagement, with subjects ranging from foreign policy to the preservation of the nation's natural heritage. He was also an avid and discerning reader of poetry, a fact that surprised many who knew him only through his public persona as a man of action. The poet Robert Frost, who knew Roosevelt personally, observed that he was our kind. He quoted poetry to me. He knew poetry. As editor of the Outlook magazine, Roosevelt enjoyed weekly access to a large and educated national audience, a platform from which he could continue to shape public opinion on matters both great and small. In all, Roosevelt authored approximately 18 books, each published in multiple editions, addressing subjects as diverse as his own autobiography, the history of the Naval War of 1812, the experiences of the Rough Riders, ranching, exploration, and wildlife. His most ambitious literary undertaking was the 4-volume narrative work titled The Winning of the West, a comprehensive examination of the American frontier in the 18th and early 19th centuries. In this magnum opus, Roosevelt advanced his interpretation of American development, locating in the heroic struggles of wilderness hunters and Indian fighters, acting with minimal government assistance or oversight, the sources of the distinctive American character, and the emergence of what he termed a new American race.